Okay, cool. All right, great. Well, how are you doing?
Well, I'm an extraordinary time. When did we speak last? Was it a week ago or a little bit
It
more?
was it was not last Friday, but the Friday before that. So a little bit over, yeah, a little bit over a week. Yeah.
Okay, so right. I mean, we've had a pandemic explosion since we last spoke. I mean, it was coming, and I think we
Yeah.
were both aware of it, but yeah. How are you guys safe?
Oh yeah, yeah, we're fine. We're in Washington, which was the epicenter for the United States. So they started
Right.
cracking down on it, I think, pretty a lot stronger than some places. So yeah, they canceled schools till the end of April.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Now opening
I
restaurants. There's no more restaurants.
Restaurants are closed down for you in Washington State? Yeah, right.
Yeah.
No, that sounds reasonable. Yeah, we're heading here in Toronto. We're heading towards pretty much full lockdown. I think that non-essential businesses will probably be closed tomorrow. I think the main concern is around the border because you know we're not here up here. We're not entirely fond of how the U.S. administration has handled containment. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. 1 second. My son is coming in. Yeah.
Why isn't YouTube working?
I don't know, but I need you to do that for an hour while I do this. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
But I don't know what to watch.
Can you help? Can you figure it out? Can you figure it out? Sweetheart, just look and see what there is. Okay. You close the door. You close the door. I'll be down there. I'll be down there in a little bit. Okay, but just keep doing that. All right. Yeah. So all kids at home.
Right.
Well, actually, my I was able to get because my youngest goes to preschool and they have they've created like a 10-person like whatever effort for childcare or something like that.
Right.
So anyway, well, yeah. So pandemic aside, uh, actually it's funny because one of the posts that I read in one of the groups that I'm in was that the only reason that this Yogi Bhajan story hasn't become more publicized is that there's this virus going on. So I don't know how true that is, but it's a interesting theory that
Well, in terms of media attention, there's only so much to go around. I can say that it was last Thursday, I think, that my second article on Shivananda Yoga was released through Jen at Medium, and whereas the first one I think had something like 30,000 views in the first day. I think the total views for the second one are around 12 or 13,000 views, and within a few hours of the publishing date, the WHO had used pandemic in their definition of the crisis. I think that was the first big 10-point drop in the Dow that afternoon.
uh,
So yeah, I think there is definitely something to uh, media resources and what journalists have time to pay attention to, for sure.
yeah. So when we ended last time we were speaking, we were getting into this really interesting topic of spiritual names, and then we had to go. So I was hoping we could talk about moving forward in
Right,
this episode.
for
Um,
sure.
and I think that that's a really interesting thing to launch off of because so many people are using their spiritual names from this tradition, but also like myself, I've actually legally changed my name. Um, so we're in this thing like I had been asking myself actually even before this happened because I was starting to question a lot of this years ago. And excuse me, my throat. I never edit this, but I'm gonna have to edit some stuff. Um, I'm I was starting to think like, gee, do I want a name that's associated with this? Should I change my name again? And then I was thinking, well, names are interesting in general because you don't necessarily agree with what your great grandfather did, and yet there you are with his name, So I was hoping you could speak to that.
Right. I think the first thing that it brings up, and I might have mentioned this at the tail end of our last discussion, is that there's a kind of working theory in a lot of the cult literature about the pre-group identity and then the post-group identity. And one of the things that in recovery from a high demand group is often called upon is the reestablishment of relationships with people who knew you before you changed. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know what your given names were, but there's a lot of people who do, right? And the question is, one question would be, whatever your given names were, what do those people remember of that person? And and for you, who it sounds like you've spent a number of years gradually moving away from the group. That might not be as acute, but for somebody who's kind of waking up quite suddenly or acutely to, what have I actually been part of? Then there might be a starker difference between the group identity that is actually consecrated by the name, sealed up really by the name, and the everything that the birth name represents. I mean, the birth name is also, the transition from birth name to spiritual name is also pertinent in relation to the fact that the most high demand groups end up actively superseding familial bonds in terms of allegiance and importance. So, especially according to Alexandra Stein, who applies attachment theory to cultic dynamics, the primary job of the group is to make the group itself the primary caregiving structure. And in that sense, it's going to override the family constellations, and even it will rewire the attachment patterning that people came in with. So there's something really super symbolic and also very poignant about the change to the spiritual name and the adoption of the spiritual name. And I think as an outsider, when I look at Kundalini Yoga culture in general, the change to the name, the change of name it will be reinforced by radical change in daily behavior, but then also a change in dress and accoutrement and presentation and bearing, social bearing in the world. So there are really distinct markers of now I have crossed over into a different type of reality, and this is what I belong to now. And those things can all be really, really helpful and transformative for people, and they can also disconnect them from the continuity of the rest of their lives.
I think that is something that, so I see a number of sort of like mini struggles going on. One of them is, have I been part of a cult? The second one is, are these teachings legitimate? And then that other one, which is like, I'm sorry, what did you just mention? My morning brain is not as acute as my brain.
I think I gave a whole list, so I'd have to.
There's a few, yes. There's a few things going on, but I for example never had to give up my family ties or anything like that. But I sort of see that as a product of having come into this at a time when the leader, still very much present in the culture, had died.
Right.
And I actually watched the Bikram documentary this weekend, and I was thinking how that kind of plays into, this versus the Bikram yoga community, who's, watching Bikram go and do these trainings in other countries. We're not seeing that in the Kundalini yoga community because Yogi Bhajan is deceased, which means one, he's not a predator anymore, so we're not afraid of that. But it also means that the people who have stories aren't able to kind of see his realization of this.
Right. Well, I mean, one thing to say about the comparison between Bikram and what's happening in KY is that anecdotally, what I've heard from a number of sources is that the news has and the revelations have been slower to penetrate non-English speaking communities than they have. I mean, the Premka group is in English, and so I'm fielding emails and DMs from people in Spanish speaking countries and Portuguese speaking countries, and Italian speaking countries, and they, the people are describing being extremely isolated within cultures that for the most part have not allowed the information to penetrate. Maybe there's a language barrier, maybe there are cultural barriers. I know that in many of the modern yoga movements that have imploded in one area of the world, usually the English speaking area of the world, they can actually gain strength and a kind of resilience in other places. Two groups in which that's currently happening is in the Ashtanga yoga world, the teachings and trainings are actually ramping up in Eastern Europe and in Russia because there's an active anti-Me Too movement in these places that looks at my book or looks at the work of people like Karen Rain or Jubilee Cook as being part of some sort of Western liberal conspiracy to undermine patriarchal righteousness or something like that. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see some of that as well taking place within the broader KY community. So it's not like there's going to be some sort of evenness of revelation or everybody being on the same page. And when leaders are still alive, what will happen is that they will go from places where the media has damaged their brand to places where the media hasn't touched them yet. And so I'd be interesting to see in the internal politics of KY whether that starts to happen, whether people who maybe made their mark on the world in Los Angeles will suddenly decide that it would be really good to set up in Thailand or something like that. Yeah. But I mean, I think the general theme that we're discussing is like, how do we identify according to the group? And just to come back to names for a moment, when I'm really interested in the number of people who might have actually legally changed their names. Do you have a sense of how many people did that?
I heard from one of the elders once that people weren't doing it as much as they used to.
Right.
But no, I don't really know.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, because that's a huge investment, right? I mean, that ends up getting on all your ID and it creates a new credit trail and all of that stuff.
Yeah, I did it at a time when I was going to change my name to my husband's at the time name. So
Right.
it seemed like, well, might as well do the whole thing. I'm gonna have to change all my credit cards anyway, kind of thing. We didn't have to change our birth certificate, although you can opt to do that.
Right.
And everybody that knew me then still knows me, and they either call me by my by Sirgun, or I used to be Porter, and so it.
Right. Now I'm wondering too, I know you're supposed to be asking me questions, but I'm wondering if I can ask you.
It's a conversation.
Right. You must be of the age at which your own entrance into the group, you're meeting people who are your age, but who are actually born into it as well. Mm-hmm. Right. Now, and just to say a little bit more about group identification and the pre-group self and the post-group self, I'm also very interested to see what happens to the so-called India kids and the people who are first and perhaps even second generation now Kundalini yoga, because they're in an extraordinary position in the sense that there is no pre-group self. Mm-hmm. The best resource for this, if your readers are interested, is Janja Lalich's Escaping Utopia. The subtitle is Growing Up in a Cult, Getting Out and Starting Over. And it's a great subtitle, but she's actually describing an extraordinarily difficult process, because when you are brought up within the reality of, Sikh Dharma as being the world, it's very difficult to actually conceptualize what it would be like to not have that authority framework. One of the groups that I study in depth, and I've got a feature coming out on, is Shambala International. And they're into their second generation of people born into the group. And the group was so tightly unified around the premise that Chogyam Trungpa was actually some sort of divine emperor, worldly yet divine emperor of a mystical, paradigm called the Kingdom of Shambhala. That, some of these kids were given passports when they were born. They were, where their names are written in Tibetan and English. Some of them are given, ceremonial money. They are, they're brought into sun camp when they're kids during the summer, and they're taught the national anthem of Shambhala. There's almost like a pseudo government that is created alongside the real world, except that a lot of the kids don't actually get to live for very long in the real world. And that creates a lot of problems when the group falls apart, when the parents leave, when the child becomes a teenager and they go, oh, geez, what else is out there, or what's going on? Or when one of those children becomes a victim of institutional abuse and they don't have anywhere to turn to because all of the adults that they know are actually complicit within the group. So yeah, there's if our general topic is how do we identify in relationship to the group and what are the markers by which we're committed, it's really the people who are born into it that are extraordinarily enmeshed to the point where the group identity can feel as though it's really woven into their DNA.
Yeah. So I see that. And I saw that, when I would hear the stories from my friends who grew up, going to India and being part of the schools that were at that point not an actual Kundalini yoga school. They were an Indian boarding school.
Right.
So, now the school exists in a different form and people don't come back with nearly as many bad stories.
Right.
But I would hear the stuff that happened just to one friend, and I could not understand how she could not be angry with her parents.
Right.
It was really hard for me, but at a certain point I was like, well, okay, I mean, I can't, I can't tell you how to feel about this. But I knew there was like just a not thinking about it, kind of like, well, that's just how things are.
Well, also we have to consider the gradations of safety, right? It's like if there is parental neglect, and this is very, very common within high demand groups, because the basic premise is that the group itself will take care of the children. And if the group doesn't take care of the children, then the leader's mission will take care of the children. If the leader's mission doesn't take care of the children, then the leader's ideology will take care of the children. There's always some sort of buck passing on up to a vaguer and more abstract authority. And so, for most of the children or children who are now grown up, who grew up in groups like this, who I've spoken to, it's very, very difficult for them to, there's a spectrum. Some of them are enraged at their parents.
Mm-hmm.
But that has usually resulted in the very difficult social circumstance of being totally alienated from them. And then they lose that family support. They have to start over somewhere entirely different. But I would say in more cases, I've spoken to people who have done their best to rebond with their parents in opposition to the group, so that the family unit can generate its own kind of internal understanding of its relationship to the group, and gain some sort of oppositional power or resilience power that way. And also, many of the children that I've spoken to who've grown up in groups like these express a great deal of empathy, especially for their mothers, in relation to the amount of social control that they realized the family was under. And so, yeah, there's a spectrum of expressions for sure. I would say that, just off the bat, the person who doesn't express any kind of misgiving or anger or even irritation towards their parents, like, what did you actually choose for me here? My guess would be, without knowing anything about the person, is that for them, the parents are still a legitimate source of safety. In opposition to the group, right? In terms of buffering the child from the group itself. So it's very, very complex. And when groups get intergenerational, the line between family allegiance and cultic allegiance becomes erased. And so when people are recovering from that situation, that line has to reform somehow. Like, oh no, this is my family. This was my home growing up. These are the relationships that I'm committed to. I don't have to, continually sort of choose the group over my parents anymore, or my parents, ideally shouldn't have to choose the group over me. But with regard to this, I'm just remembering on the subject of parental neglect, and by parental neglect, I'm not using that phrase in a way that I hope feels shaming in any way. It's just simply a fact that when children are brought up in these groups, there's usually a sense of communal care. But there is very often no clear sense of who's actually in charge, except for the overarching authority of the group itself, or the leader's sort of, sensibility, or their mission, or their demands. Mm-hmm. One of the groups that I was in, I had a stepdaughter at the time, and I think when we entered, she was probably, I don't know, I want to say 7 or 8 years old, something like that. And she grew up with a number of kids who were her age. And because I was the step parent, I was already a little bit arm's length in terms of responsibility. I certainly played a very, very strong role, but I wasn't the one who was making any kind of final decisions about anything. And, she already had 2 parents. So, but what I do remember is that there was this general sense amongst the adults that, oh, the kids are going to be fine. Oh, the kids are just going to be, they're getting along. In fact, they're smarter than us. They're pure, they're free. They are, what can go wrong for them? They're actually held in a very loving environment that's not part of the outside world, which is filled with all kinds of delusions about what the nature of reality is. So, yeah, I think that I have this personal experience of this bias towards not really centering yourself as the parent, the person who can take full responsibility, because your capacity to take full responsibility for yourself actually has been stripped or degraded by the group. You're not responsible for yourself, actually. You're when you're under undue influence, somebody else is calling the shots anyway. So it's actually very difficult to reposition yourself as the parent, the one who is going to be the end of the line with regard to the care of the child.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, I've actually never experienced much of any negative anything from being part of this group, besides what I feel to be sort of an internal struggle with myself and, you know, how I live my life, and how my yearning to, you know, to be making my own decisions, you know, outside of this box of thinking that I joined. But
Right.
one of the things that has been so amazing about being part of the Kundalini Yoga community was that aspect of, you know, for example, like when women have babies, we do this 40-day thing. The whole
Right.
community, you know, gives meals, you know, to the mother.
Right.
And I wouldn't say we exclude, you know, people didn't like exclude other people from joining that either. So it was a very fuzzy line between, you know, where the group, how the group defined itself, because it wasn't like we all lived on a compound.
Right.
We were very much integrated into society, but with this internal idea of who we were,
Right.
in relation to other people. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I used in our last conversation, the wildfire metaphor,
Yeah,
for
the hot spots.
right, right. I think what you're speaking about gets to the same kind of territory, which is um, when does a when does a high demand group uh, become safe in a way, like at what periphery away from the center, at what I guess, what would you say, circle away from the center are we
Mhm.
talking about, a fairly strongly bonded community that is relatively healthy. And I would say that uh, to the extent that you're going to find spaces in the Kundalini Yoga world where people are not lying to each other. They are not creating systems of emotional or financial dependency amongst each other. They're not putting people in a position where they dread leaving, where there is no behavioral control or informational control or thought control or emotional control. That's very possible. Um, and so if you're describing a sort of Kundalini outpost or kind of franchise community that is actually taking care of itself without vertical power structures that
Mhm.
are manipulating those who have less power, that's entirely possible. And then the only thing to be aware of there is whether or not the ideology that's communicated within that relatively safe group acts as a kind of gateway, or what Hannah Arendt calls a transmission belt into the center, right? Like if a person really, really enjoys the community care that they participated in during the 40 days postnatal, and gets the idea that what they would like to do is to become a teacher in this, or to train further, or they really want to connect to the source of this teaching, then the question is, um, who's the person who would have authority in that group, and where would they direct that recruit to? Because that's kind of like the key question with regard to whether or not a person gets far closer towards the center, or closer towards one of the hot spots where these stronger ties of deception, dependence, and dread of leaving start to take hold.
Yeah. Well, those are some interesting considerations. I obviously don't have an answer, but
Right.
um,
I mean, one example that I can use, is that, like, from the Ashtanga world, is that there are hundreds of local Ashtanga yoga shalas
mhm.
in urban centers, rural centers all over the world. Dozens of different languages people are teaching in, um, and you know. Uh, Technically, you can't get authorized to teach Ashtanga yoga or certified to teach Ashtanga yoga except through the physical blessing of the Joyce family. Now, if you are of the older generation that was certified by Patabi Joyce before he died in 2009, then you definitely got your permission to teach in relationship to his body. And what I mean by that is that he had to see you every year, probably for 3 years, maybe as many as 6 years, but you had to stay for several months at a time. And every single day he'd have his hands on you to quote unquote adjust you into the correct posture or give you permission to go further. Now, that is completely inextricable from physical and sexual assault. And so anybody who is certified by Pattabhi Jois either witnessed or suffered through physical and sexual assault. It's possible that there are some people who will still earnestly say, I had no idea that that was going on. But I think that that's super hard to assess. But what I can say about that is, if you didn't know it was going on, that doesn't mean that you have gone on to provide safe space, right? In fact, if you were unaware that you were in an environment of implied consent and somatic dominance, that's probably a good indication that you would be unaware if you were recreating that in your own studio. So anyway, it's really hard to teach Ashtanga yoga without a direct somatic relationship to a physical and sexual abuser. Sharath Jois is now the authorizer / certifier for Ashtanga yoga. Now, there are no reports of sexual assault against him, but there are many anecdotal reports of him injuring people through adjustments. And it's not like, Sharath Jois has changed the family policy around adjustments. He might not be sexually assaulting people, but it's not like he's using consent cards. He's not, it's not like he went out and he got, massage therapy training or, did any special medical studies or anything like that. So, what's the upshot? The upshot is anybody who teaches at a legitimate Ashtanga Yoga Mysore Shala program anywhere in the world will have a bodily, visceral, direct connection to this family that has a deeply unresolved abuse issue. Mm-hmm. And so for the student in Toronto or Ottawa or Berlin or whatever who walks into that studio, what are the chances of them encountering real safety? It's possible. It's possible that that teacher, will have somehow learned consent, will somehow have learned how to provide informed consent for adjustments, will know something about safe spaces, will know something about, trauma awareness. It's possible that they will be able to provide a safer space than the Jois family did. But let's say that they haven't been clear about the abuse history in the lineage, and it's not listed on their bio. They haven't made any kind of statement about it. And let's say that while their own teaching is relatively safe or kind or empathetic, that on their front desk they have a series of Ashtanga materials, literature, books, videos that all identify the Jois family as being the kind of sainted channel through which this method comes. And let's say that the really dedicated student in Toronto or Ottawa or Berlin says, oh, okay, well, this is a really amazing practice. I want to learn more about it. How do I go and do that? It's at that moment that the teacher is able to say, well, actually, it's fine if you just learn with me. Or they say, well, if you really want to go to the source, you've got to go back to Mysore. And if they say that second thing, they are acting as recruiters for the organization.
Right.
And so, in the theme of moving forward, which is the phrase that you used in the beginning of our conversation, the question comes up over and over again, what do I do if I learned how to teach yoga within an abusive organization or with an organization that has an institutional abuse history? And my answer to that, that I offered in my book is to foster transparency around your educational history and to actually take a public stand around your relationship to the school that you went to, and then to show somehow your clients, your student base, the people that you're going to be providing services to, how you have understood the problem of your school and how you've mitigated for it. So what this means is, don't erase your bio because, you went to, because your teacher trainer in Iyengar was Manuso Manos, and, he's been thrown out for sexual abuse. You write down, you keep your bio exactly as it was. You did these trainings with Manuso Manos, and then, 2019, it was shown to me through this investigation and that investigation that Manos actually has a history of sexual assault. This is what I know about this. These are the suspicions I had, if that's true. And then the person should go on and say, and because my education has obviously been compromised, here's what I've done to mitigate that compromise. Here's the trauma awareness training that I've taken. Here's the, Yoga Service Council work that I've done. This is how I've become a mandated reporter in my community for sexual abuse. You have to show the public that you understand where you came from and how you've dealt with it, because anybody can Google. And anybody can figure out that, this certificate that you've been waving around from an abusive institution that's not good anymore. That's actually a liability. And the thing is that people in the Ashtanga world and in the Iyengar world in particular have been waving around their certificates for the last 40 years saying, I went to Pune every year for 40 years. Well, that is actually not a good sign anymore. Mm-hmm. What would be a good sign is for you to say, I went to Pune for 40 years. I kind of woke up from a bit of a dream. I learned a lot of good things there, but there were some bad things going on there too. And this is how I've tried to educate myself to make sure that I don't pass the bad things along with the good. So, the person who has utterly failed to do this, or one of many, I would say, is somebody like Eddie Stern, who is, the primary teacher of American representative of the Joyce family in terms of Ashtanga yoga. And after my book came out and there was a bunch of negative press, he closed his yoga school in Brooklyn. I mean, there's probably an economic thing going on there. But then he also just rebranded his own yoga business under his own name. So if you go to eddiestern.com and you go to bio, I don't think he mentions Patabi Joyce's name. Okay. And the thing is that nobody would know who Eddie Stern was without Patabi Joyce. So it's like he's accumulated this social privilege through a relationship with a yoga institution with an unresolved abuse history. Now it's erased. That's not safety. Right. There's a guy specific to Kundalini Yoga. Maybe you know of Dr. Gabor Mate, who he's an MD who is Canadian. He works amongst marginalized populations in East Vancouver, which is kind of like the epicenter for substance issues and homelessness and sex work in Vancouver. And he recently but several years ago, paired up with Satdaram Kaur here in Ontario, who is a naturopathic doctor, and they created together, and I think there were other people involved, they created a yoga program, or a yoga and addiction recovery program called Beyond Addiction. And, 2 or 3 years ago, it became clear to me that Kundalini Yoga had this hidden abuse history and that it was going to explode. I was talking to Philip at the time. I had done my own research into the lawsuits. And I wrote to Dr. Mate, and I said to his publicist, anyway, and I said, look, I understand the virtue of partnering with Kundalini Yoga for this particular program, but are you aware that this is an organization that has an unresolved abuse history? Because any anybody who walks into a Beyond Addiction program who has a trauma history, who has a sexual abuse history, anybody can Google this lawsuit brought by Kate Felt, and they're not going to feel safe in this program, which is, you know, ostensibly offering healing on many levels to the participants. So, you know, are you concerned about this? And the publicist wrote back and said, you know, Dr. Mate is aware that the potential for abuse exists in every institution. I was like, that is not an answer. Um, you know, are you actually going to take a look at this material? Is it going to be of interest to you? Are you going to, you know, investigate? Are you going to ask Satnaram Kaur or anybody else who's running that program, how do you stand in relationship to this abuse history? Because nobody professionalizes into Kundalini yoga without benefiting from the silence of Yogi Bhajan's victims. So it's just, it's something that people have to become transparent about, and they have to show that they've done their research. I don't see any other way around it.
Yeah. That's, I really appreciate you bringing up that point about transparency. I think that that's really, really beautiful, because I think, you know, if you have been involved, especially, I'm thinking about one of the teachers that is one of the bigger teachers in Kundalini Yoga, Guru Singh, who just put out this public apology that was
Right.
really, did you happen to read that?
I did read it. I found it very interesting. I'd be interested
Yeah.
to hear what your take on it was.
Well, you know, I don't know him on a personal level, so I can't say what, you know, what he's specifically referring to, because he alludes to a lot of stuff in the apology. But I felt like it was the sort of boldest statement that someone of his generation had made, up into that, you know, up into that point publicly.
Well, it's interesting for you as an insider or as a former insider to say that you weren't quite sure what he was referring to, because I think that says a lot, because what stood out to me about that statement was its vagueness.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was obviously beautifully written. It seemed to be emotionally engaged, and it also seemed to suggest that, oh wow, I've been waking up from a cult-like dream after all of these years. Now, that I think we have to be really clear about the difference between a confession that you might bring to therapy
Mm-hmm.
and a statement that is appropriate for you to make as a public figure. You know, here's somebody I understand who's like, you know, has strong leadership, I don't know, power within the global community. And, you know, and if they have attained that position through, and I don't know, I just want to be clear, I don't know anything about this guy, but if they have attained that position through closeness to Bhajan, through mimicking a certain amount of the charisma of Bhajan or sharing it, but not sharing so much of it that they actually were booted out at the right time, because this is often what happens, is that especially male lieutenants who attain too much power close to the leader will get excommunicated.
Mm-hmm.
The person who is able to attain social power in a group like that usually cannot have done so without a combination of facilitating, enabling, and bystanding in relationship to abuse. And so now he might come out and be specific about what he's actually sorry about. So I don't want to like foreclose on that, but I do want to say that if the statement remains on the level of kind of expressing emotional sorrow or regret or something like that without getting specific, then I think people who are reading really want to look at whether or not they are being further emotionally manipulated, because you know, it would be very effective for a leader in that position to generate empathy. And what is more appropriate at this particular juncture is accountability. And specifically, accountability with regard to, okay, well, what's going to happen now for survivors? Because as soon as somebody who has social and financial capital within the organization starts speaking about, in the stream of reform, what I want to hear is, okay, where's the money? How are you actually going to care for the people whose lives were ruined by this group? Do we have an idea of how much money Pamela Dyson had to put into therapy over the years? Do we have any idea what the India kids have had to spend on, psychiatric appointments or body work or treating their PTSD or what have you? Show me the money. Your emotions are great, but I would like to see real steps towards accountability, especially if you continue to enjoy social power and capital in the group.
Yeah, having experienced him as a teacher, I'm optimistic about where his actions are going to go. So we'll see.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I as I said, I don't know anything about it, and I don't want to foreclose on the possibility.
No, and we don't really know.
It's just that, it's become kind of a secondary study of mine to look at abuse crisis statements, and it's very rare that leaders in organizations that have benefited from institutional abuse actually do them well. Usually because they often believe that being a good guy, showing the fruit of your spiritual practice, let's say, connecting with your heart, doing all of those things that the content of the practice is telling everybody that it's supposed to happen, they usually think that that's enough, or that it's the best place to start. And from a survivor's point of view, it's not really the place to start. The place to start is, okay, who's going to be in charge of creating safety now? Not who is going to win over more hearts and minds.
That's a great point. We just have a few minutes left. I would love to hear you talk about anything else you feel like is important for someone to hear that wants to move forward.
Maybe what I'd say is, just continuing on this theme, and I've written a couple of things that I'll send links to about this, is that Kundalini Yoga is now entering the reform stage of the abuse crisis. I mean, maybe that's premature. There's a quote unquote investigatory stage, but really the details are and the bare bones, or the raw facts of people's narratives are out and circulating. So whatever an olive branch does to formalize those narratives, there's going to be some advantage there. I have some questions about whether or not they're the appropriate organization for it. But what I think people in your community and, or your former community, want to be really aware of is who starts jostling for position as a reformer. And what are they using in order to do this? I wrote a little analysis of Snatam Kaur's statement, where she describes that the mantras will always be at the heart of how I heal myself and conjoin with community. My point there was to say the mantras were used during periods of enforcing institutional abuse as well. So let's not pretend that they have some magical ability to bring peace and transparency and justice. And I don't know that she's, trying to become a reformer, but I would just say, like pay very close attention to people who are already professionalized at a high level within Kundalini yoga, suddenly having revelations about how they should change everything. And, maybe they'll go on and offer, trauma awareness training in Kundalini yoga or something like that. Don't accept that. That would be my advice. Anybody who is currently in a leadership position professionally in Kundalini yoga is likely unqualified to be a robust voice of reform. And alternatively, what people can look to is what survivors of sexual abuse within yoga communities and Buddhist communities have started to put together in terms of policies and procedures going forward. So I think anybody who's trying to do any reform within Kundalini yoga who is not hiring Karen Rain or somebody like that as a consultant to vet all of their materials and to approve who's going to be teaching what, or to at least give feedback, they're not really doing reform. We have to be able to distinguish between reform and rebranding is just not going to cut it.
Yeah, wow. I think that that gives us all a lot to think about.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Anybody, okay, so the parallel there would be, anybody who tries to do real reform within Kundalini yoga, who is not figuring out how to pay somebody like Pamela Dyson for their advice as a consultant in a way that is safe for her. I mean, she might not want to do it, but that would be the first question. It's like, oh wow, you had the courage and the clarity and the lucidity to, after 25 years or whatever it was, to actually lay this all out for us. I'm going to hire you with the significant resources that I have from this multinational corporation to figure out what people like you would have needed in order to be safe or to come forward. And so, again, I'm not speaking for Pamela at all. She might not want to do it. She might not care. And so then that conversation ends there. But the person who wants to reform Kundalini yoga, who's not seeking the consultation of a survivor of the organization, isn't really doing the work.
Yeah, and one of the things that, I mean, you could speak about that if you feel like it, about an olive branch, is that they will only be looking at stories from people directly abused by Yogi Bhajan, whereas the organization has perpetuated abuse in many other ways, such as, for the kids who were sent to India who
Right.
weren't directly abused by the leadership.
Right. I mean, I have a feeling, I don't feel entirely prepared to analyze the olive branch mandate, but I can say in general that I think they know, because I've seen them work with the Shambala organization, and I've studied how that's gone a little bit. I can say that I haven't been confident that the investigative team is large enough, that it has the legal expertise, that it is going to be able to figure out its mandated reporting necessities or directives according to jurisdiction. Also, the whole sort of premise of the organization is bending towards a spiritualized form of restorative justice, and that might not be appropriate for survivors. Then there are questions about the scope, for sure. Right. I mean, a fundamental premise of cult studies is that nobody abuses alone. Mm-hmm. And so if the research is limited to, who did Yogi Bhajan directly assault or financially abuse, then that's going to give you a very narrow picture that can actually work to the institution's advantage, because then they can ostensibly pretend as though, well, we've dealt with that, or we've sealed that off, or we've gotten rid of the bad apple who is dead anyway, and now we know the full truth of things. But a real investigation would have to be open-ended. It would have to be inviting testimonies of abuse from the entire organization over the last 40 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that would take money.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And ultimately, I think it seems to me, and I could be wrong, but it seems to me that the intention of it is not so much to, get to the bottom of all abuse, but to sort of like lightly ask the question, did he really do this or did he not really do this? Because I think that's for the people inside the organization, that's what they might be most curious about.
Right. I mean, a parallel situation that I'm much more familiar with, and also because it's ongoing, is with the investigation that has been commissioned by the Shivananda Yoga organization into institutional abuse there. And it was prompted by, or it was responding to the story or the testimony released by Julie Salter back in December that I then went on to report in January. That was against Vishnu Devananda himself, the founder of the organization. He died in 1993. They initially responded by saying, well, we will hire an independent investigator for this to assess whether or not the testimonies of the women who spoke about Vishnu Devananda were true or not. And so here's the thing, is that Julie Salter, who worked for the organization for, I'm trying to remember, I think Pamela Dyson is 16 years, and I think Julie is 17 years for Shivananda. The first communication that she'd had from Shivananda Yoga in years was from their lawyer saying, I would like to meet with you to find out whether what you're saying is true. And she's like, nope, actually, I wrote what was true. I don't need to talk to you about it as well. And so, there's an internal argument about, the efficacy of talking to the organization's appointed lawyer or not. Is she going to be good at that? Is she going to issue good recommendations? There's also questions about the initial scope of the investigation, which has since been expanded to the institutional level. So yeah, you're hitting on all of the main points that are going to come into sharp relief in the Kundalini story. Is an olive branch going to be sensitive with survivors' details? Are they going to start from the perspective of trust or belief? Are they going to start from the perspective or with the mandate of looking at institutional abuse and complicity, or are they just going to focus on what one bad guy did? Yeah, those questions are all going to be really interesting to explore for the community, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you so much again for,
You're welcome.
sharing what you know about all of this. I heard from the last podcast that it was just people were listening to it, multiple times because it was so new.
Great.
So
well, I thank you so much for the opportunity, and I also just want to own that as a 2-time cult survivor myself, sometimes I get a little bit, impassioned about these things, and so I hope I don't come across as unsympathetic. I think that anybody who is navigating through this abuse crisis is in an awful position, and it hurts a lot, but it gets better. It gets better through education. It gets better through reestablishing, outside community connections or forming new friendships. And so I really hope that goes well for all of your listeners as they sort of reframe how they stand in relationship to the organization, which has probably given them a lot, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's that separation it's that sort of mental sorting of like, all right, what do I keep and what do I release?
Absolutely. And maybe one thought to leave everybody with is that what you keep, probably more often than not, is what you created. And it's a sign of, it's probably less what you received from an abusive organization than what you were able to make according to your own virtue and your skill and your own goodness, your own earnestness. One of my favorite quotes from one of the legal scholars who works on this stuff is, the high demand group takes the best part of you. And but the corollary to that is, in a way, you also leave with the best part of you if you really take account of, oh, these are all of the things that I learned how to do. These are the strong bonds that I made. I one of the groups that I was in, I learned how to cook, and there was 300 people in the ashram, and on every Wednesday, my friend Rupi and I would make dinner for all 300 people, just the two of us. And we spent all day doing it, and it was the most fun I ever had in my life. And I, to this day, I mean, it's almost 20 years later, I still make Rupi's recipes in my home for my own children. And I remember the joy and the exuberance of the cooking that he taught me. And that's never going to go away. And so then what was the group in relationship to that? What was Endeavor Academy in relationship to that? It was just the building, in a way. And we could have learned that anywhere. We could have spent that time anywhere. And so I don't have to feel conflicted about, the wonderful recipes that I'm able to pass on to my children. I can say, oh yeah, I got this from my friend, and he really was my friend. We were there under strange circumstances, but life is often strange, so it's okay.
Oh, that's really beautiful. Thank you so much for leaving with that.
Yeah.
And I will post your links and the links that you want to send me to those articles that you mentioned, I think,
Right.
In the blog description notes, so that people can click on that. Do you have anything else you want to leave with?
No, you've asked me that 3 times now, and I've gone over time. So
because I just love listening. So okay, I will say we're done.
All right.
Thank you so much, and stay safe, and
yeah, you too.
yeah.
All
All
right.
right. Bye.
Take care. Take care.